So I want to talk a little bit about the psychological functions of dying and rising God myths. And before I get into that, I just want to go over again what we mean when we talk about functions in general and the psychological function in particular. So you may remember that Joseph Campbell comes up with these 4 functions of mythology. And what he meant by that is that myths serve 4 kinds of purposes, or rather they teach 4 kinds of lessons. Lessons about the nature of life, or lessons about the individual self, or about how society works, or about how the world works. And the psychological function in particular works in a couple of different ways. One way it works is that the myth is a metaphor for the cycle of human life from birth to death. And dying, rising God myths can often be seen in that way. The God emerges in the story and then dies, and this may be a metaphor for birth to the end of childhood. And then when the God dies and then is reborn, this is a metaphor for the transformation of the child into the adult. Another way that these myths work, psychologically speaking, is that they offer wisdom that was necessary for people in order to take their place in society as grown adults. So the myth might be metaphorically teaching about the need to curb your impulses or control your temper or cope with your fear of change in general. And dying, rising gods then ushered people through these big issues and then fundamentally taught them through metaphor a lesson that was crucial to their survival and to becoming adults. And when it comes to dying and rising God myths, this psychological function can work in a number of different ways. And as you can see on your slide, I've got 3 bullet points. So let's talk a little bit about those 3 points. This is generally how I understand dying and rising God myths to work according to the psychological function. And you may come up with other ideas that work in the same way, and that's fine too. So the first one is that the dying and rising God served a psychological function because it helped to teach that there was an immortality that was possible after death, that there's some kind of permanent existence to look forward to in order to help people cope with their very human fear of death. And the ancient myth of Osiris and Isis sort of worked in that way. Osiris dies, actually not once, but twice, and both times is revived by his sister and wife, Isis. And the second time, he can't take his place back in the physical world. He has to go down to the underworld, and he becomes the god of the underworld there. And this helped ancient Egyptians understand that death was not something to be afraid of because it was just one stage in the larger cycle of life, that people would have, if they lived a virtuous life, a possibility of eternal life in the underworld. And in that underworld, you never get old and you never get sick and you're reunited with your friends and family. And so you don't need to fear death at all because it's just a journey to a new life. But psychologically speaking, these myths might also teach that you don't necessarily have a literal afterlife in heaven or in paradise or the underworld, but you do get a kind of immortality. Ancient Greeks and ancient Norse people, for example, lived a life that was very centered around war, and they had to be able to prepare warriors to be willing to sacrifice their lives on behalf of the community. And so dying, rising god myths, like the story of Balder the Beautiful or the story of Dionysus or Adonis, helped these ancient people understand that Death is permanent, but your name will live on after you die. You'll live on in your children. You'll live on in your legends, the stories that we will tell of you about the deeds that you accomplished and the good kind of a person you were. And so in that way, nobody really ever dies. They have this possibility of an everlasting life. So long as they live a good life, they'll be remembered. The second point I want to address has to do with how psychologically dying and rising God myths taught people how to overcome tragedy or personal setback. And these myths are like flood myths in the sense that you have to let the past go and you have to reinvent yourself. But where flood myths focus more on recreation, dying and rising God myths focus on the end of one stage and the beginning of another. And so they're really a great metaphor for something like childhood, the need to get over your fear of growing up, which is a frightening thing for lots of kids, and to be able to let go of your childhood self or let go of any immature stage of yourself in order to transform into the newer and wiser you. Dying and rising God myths help us cope with loss, the loss not just of our own childhoods, but the loss of our children as they transform into adults. Dying and rising God myths help us overcome the loss of a spouse through divorce, for example, and they teach us that we need to reinvent ourselves. We can't be stuck in the past. And that when we reinvent ourselves, we will renew ourselves. We will become something new. And that's not only necessary, it's a good thing. Dying and rising God myths may also teach us how to overcome or cope with just the ordinary life and how sometimes we can get stuck in a rut. We become too comfortable, perhaps so comfortable that our life loses meaning. Have you ever felt at any point in your life like you were just kind of going through the motions, like you were going to school, but you no longer knew why or got any joy out of it? You just got up every day and you went to work, but you don't like your job, it's not fulfilling, and you're just doing it to pay the bills. Dying, rising God myths helped people understand that growth and change were not only inevitable, they were sometimes necessary. And you have to be able to reinvent yourself. You have to have the courage to let this old chapter in your life end and start a new chapter. So they're really about that kind of transformation. So I also want to talk a little bit about how these stories worked in other ways. And I've given you 3 examples in the slide. Talked a little bit about Osiris, and Groot from Guardians of the Galaxy is a really great example of a dying and rising god. In the story, he literally dies, and he does so in order to save his companions. And I want to point out that dying and rising gods are the only kinds of gods who are willing to die for the sake of others. Heroes don't do that, not in mythology. And so we can't say that a person is a hero because they'll give up their lives for other people, because heroes in myths don't do that. Only dying and rising gods do that. But remember that sacrifice and their death, it's a metaphor for some kind of a change, some kind of way in which when we give of ourselves to other people, we give them our time, we give them our attention, we take care of them, we fight for them, we go to war for them, we transform ourselves and we become more bonded with our friends, our families, and our community. And we have to be able to do that. And that's why dying, rising gods feature scapegoats, because they teach us that we all have to be willing to sacrifice something, even if it's painful. It doesn't necessarily have to be your life, but it might have to be something that's really difficult for you to give up. Your patience, your time, your goods, your freedom, your convenience, your comfort. But in doing so, you will find that we remember, that we are grateful, and that we will continue to respect you, and you will be renewed as a member of our community through that sacrifice, through that act. The third example is from the movie The Martian that came out a few years ago. And Mark Watney is the main character, and he's left for dead on the planet Mars. And his companions think that he's died. He has to transform himself and the world if he wants to continue to live. So he has to try to figure out how to grow life on this dead, sandy planet on Mars. And this metaphorically teaches us that we have to let go of our past and our former selves. We have to be willing to let that go, to let that past die. We have to be willing to recreate or reinvent ourselves. And that transformation means that who we used to be is going to be gone. But when that happens, we have the opportunity to be somebody new, to have a new lease on life. So think about how these myths might be relevant to you. Think about when in your life a part of you has died and you had to become someone new, either through moving or changing jobs or divorce or the loss of something, how you had to reinvent yourself and begin your life over again. And maybe you've wanted a fresh start. Maybe you wanted the ability to move out of your parents' house or move away from a bad relationship or a rut that you had found yourself in. And you struggled to do that because it's hard and it's scary and there is a kind of a death that has to happen. Dying, rising God myths continue to work that way to help us into that next stage of life. These stories offer us the opportunity, through experiencing death vicariously, to understand that death isn't what we really need to be afraid of, as long as we understand that we are part of a cycle of life and we can recreate ourselves and reinvent ourselves. And at the end of our lives, we can continue to live on in heaven or in the memories of others. We learn that we define ourselves by what we do and the connections we have in our family, with our friends, and in our communities. And we learn that sometimes this transformation is necessary in order for life in general.